We have been looking at the relationship between language and society. We have looked at several aspects of language and several aspects of society and several domains of language use in the society. We have tried to look at society from understanding the term itself, what consists of society and what are the several domains of language use within society. And then we have juxtaposed the two, that is our understanding of language and our understanding of society and how they work with each other and how they help us understand both in terms of the use of language. That has been the focus of this course. Today, in this concluding part, I would like to wind up by revising what we have done, and I want you to focus on these parts as takeaway from this course. We have looked at three parts as far as the language is concerned. All the discussions that we have done for understanding language is divided in three parts. There are three major areas of investigation in language. All the investigations from the beginning of the discipline and the way it continues to be today can be divided into three parts. One is structure, the other is acquisition, and the third one is language change, that is variation. When we want to understand the structure of language, primarily we need to look at three parts, that is sounds, words and sentences. There is a principle in understanding of language which is called autonomy principle. The point is, structure is autonomous of sense, of meaning. We won't go into the details of that, but we want you to keep in mind the three aspects of the structure of language: sounds, words and sentences require a special attention. These domains of language help us understand formal properties of language. Like in syntax, like in phonetics, we try to study the physical parts of sounds in the sense of its places of articulations, manners of articulations, and how they originate, and what are the locations in our vocal tract which are going to be helpful in producing these sounds. In other words, the sound production mechanism and its physical parts are what we study in phonetics. When we look at the abstract aspects of sounds and its relationship with each other, that's phonology. We look at words and how words combine with each other, and then several other aspects of words, they are the part of morphology, and when they start intersecting with the domains of syntax, they become morphosyntax. These terms are not that important. What is important for us is to understand that to understand the formal properties of language, we need to look at three aspects, that is sounds, words and sentences. Syntax is the domain in which we study sentences, we study formal properties of sentences, we study what it takes to make a sentence, like subject and predicate, how subject and predicates are related to one another, that is, subjects and predicates are not merely juxtaposed next to one another to make a sentence. There is certain underlying invisible properties that operate while putting them together and giving us a grammatically viable sentence, grammatically acceptable sentence. And those study of those parts and study of the lexical parts of sentence is syntax, where the focus of the study, the object of the study is, the unit of the study is a sentence. Once we move beyond we start looking at discourse, and then comes the context. From here onwards, we start looking at the overlap between language and society. That is, the whole idea of context is part of pragmatics, and how sociological aspects of society and language interact with one another start surfacing at this point, at this level. And therefore, whenever we want to study the relationship between language and society, the domain of the study is going to be discourse. And it is right at that point where we would need to understand, only at this point we can understand the distinction between language and dialect, language and variety, language as continuum, language as a fluid idea, language and mixing, convergence. All such things are making sense only at this level of the study of discourse. And that is what we have done to understand language as a formal property, language as a formal system. We started with looking at acquisition of language. It is a very significant domain of the study of language, and it is this domain which helps us understand that language interacts with society. It is a social entity, but as much as it is part of human mind. It is one of the most sophisticated products of human mind. And while understanding acquisition, we understand that language, and in particular learning of language, is a unique human capacity. No other species has this capacity as we know. The learning of language is totally different from learning of any other aspects, from learning of anything else. We have pointed these things out, that learning to dance, learning to ride, learning to drive, learning to fly, sing, swim, anything for that matter, requires certain maturity of different parts of human body. But learning of language requires no such maturity. In fact, most part of what we contribute to the learning of language is over by the age of 5. And that is what makes learning of language and the speaking of language not only as an innate part of humans, but also makes language as a special purpose cognition, and everything else remains as general part of cognition. And this is where we try to intersect with cognitive science, and we want to understand language as a phenomena in cognition. Moving ahead, we have also seen how language was considered as part of human behavior, how language was equated with behavior. Language was considered a verbal behavior. But with the intervention of generative paradigm, generative perspective of understanding language acquisition, we see that what was missing from behaviorist paradigms of understanding language learning was the role of human mind in processing of human language. To put it in a very simple words, what makes us capable of speaking and understanding unheard of sentences, unplanned sentences, or a sentence that may or may not have been spoken before, is the capacity of human mind, which is also called generative capacity. However, the role of input that comes from the behaviorist model was recognized in the mentalist model as well. Therefore, what the whole area of a study of acquisition helps us understand nature of learning. It helps us how to combine the two and not look at them in terms of contradictions, and how development of children and development of human mind takes place. Such things are part of the acquisition of language, and when we study acquisition of language, we get to understand these realities, these aspects of language, which again helps us understanding relationship between language and society in a completely different perspective. Then we start looking at how the two, that is the acquisition of language and the structure of language, intersects with society. One of the unique nature of society is diversity, and it starts becoming apparent the moment we start looking at language from sociological perspective. The first thing that we see is also one of the inherent nature of language is change. Language changes every now and then. Language changes after every certain distance. This change could take place in the structure of language, that is, the change could be at the level of sounds, at the level of words, level of sentences. Change could take place in discourse. Change could influence convergence, which might result into pidgins, creoles and mixing, where the questions of purity of language, standardization of language and the politically charged terms of dialects of language become more viable and call our attention for an understanding of these terms. And finally, what all of this help us understand that the true nature of language becomes more apparent when we want to see the phenomena of language as a continuum and language as a fluid system itself. All of them put together are going to help us understand the use of language in various domains, and that we have seen the use of language in understanding society, culture, education, teaching and several other aspects as well. What emerges out of this as what we call as emerging insights is that the understanding of language as a social phenomena will help us understand. Understanding of language as a social phenomena, understanding of language as a phenomena of human mind, and what goes into the understanding of acquisition of language and the relationship between language and society on the grounds of these parts are going to give us takeaways like no language is standard. More importantly, no language is less standard than anything else. Therefore, no language is non-standard. This is not merely a politically correct statement. This has theoretical foundings. This is founded on a sound theoretical and empirical generalization. Similarly, a language is not a viable concept because the idea of a language does not exist. What exists is variation, variability and fluidity. We need to understand the idea of English in India, and we see that it has acquired its own identity. Therefore, it is called English of India and not English in India or Indian English alone. These things help us understand as emerging insights that we need to redefine the notion of native speakers. A native speaker of a language could be anyone, and for anyone, any language could be a native language. We only need to understand how we acquire language. Language, therefore, is not a countable entity. It comes out very emphatically in understanding and after understanding everything else that we have done so far. So, the relationship between language and society is a complex one, as complex as the relationship between language and mind, if not less. I once again invite you to revisit these things and take a look at it, because it is understanding of language as multilinguality which is going to help us develop, as we have seen, larger scholastic achievements and more social tolerance with cognitive flexibility. Thank you.